All right. In this set of slides, we're going to be looking at the theory of evolution. So this is more than just the mechanism of evolution, how populations are changing over time. But what we're specifically looking at here is how did all of the species that we see in the world come to be, right? Where did they all come from? So it is a scientific explanation for the diversity of the planet, right? Biodiversity. Before Darwin and Wallace, there were some theories, of course, as to how everything became to be, but this is one of the first scientific theories that actually held water. So we are going to go through and talk about what it is, the theory of evolution. Now, the theory of evolution by natural selection is mostly the parts that we talked about with natural selection. So we have populations that have heritable variation. Those populations produce more offspring than can survive, and not all the survivors reproduce because there are limited resources here, right? And not everyone survives. We have individuals competing for limited resources. Some of them have traits that allow them to get those resources better, so they survive and pass on more offspring. Their offspring inherit those good traits and do better than the offspring of the less fit individuals, and then eventually over time the population evolves, changes to resemble the fittest individuals, and that is how it adapts to its environment. Now, the thing we add in here for the theory of evolution is that all of the species that we see today are then descended with modification from some ancestral species that lived sometime in the past, right? So we have a situation where what we see now then is there's different sets of different populations then that have evolved from ancestors in the past, right? In some cases split from those ancestors to make new species, etc., I should say. All right. So we're going to talk about how do we get those new species. So what Darwin and Wallace were really trying to do in both their papers. So Darwin's was On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. This is where he laid out the theory in 1859 of what this origin is, or what natural selection was, and gave all his evidence. He also published some work with Wallace as well. And like I said, it was a scientific explanation for the diversity of life on Earth. They both came up with this idea after having traveled the globe a fair amount. So Wallace here is the purple. He spent time in South America, in the rainforest here, Brazil and otherwise, and also some time in Indonesia on all these little islands. Darwin famously was on the voyage of the Beagle, went around, spent a lot of time here in South America and some other places in the world, but basically they were in the tropics. And in the tropics, there is an incredible amount of biodiversity. And so when they saw this, they started seeing patterns that both of them kind of saw, and then they just kind of worked out a theory as far as how these patterns came to be. So what they were seeing in a lot of cases, what we call biogeography. They were looking at, for example, islands. And this is the Galapagos Islands. It's one of the famous places Darwin spent. And these are the finches that he talked about. So in South America here, we have some finches that live on the mainland, just off of the islands. And then the islands are quite a ways out. They're volcanic, so arose much later than the mainland. And you see finches on all of these islands, right? Well, they're similar to the finches on land, except for they're all appear to be adapted to very specifically for their environments, for the kinds of foods that they have and the local environment. So we have the cactus finch here living on Isabella, where there's all kinds of cactuses. Has this kind of long pointed beak to pull seeds from the cacti without getting injured by the spines. We've got warbler finch, which has a thin, sharp beak for spearing and catching insects in the place that it lives, which there are a lot of insects. And then we have Large groundfinch has this huge beak for cracking seeds. Well, the place where it lives has lots of seeds. So they saw this, and that species that were most similar tended to be closer to each other in terms of the islands, and then the ones that were further away from the mainland were also the most different as well. And so what they proposed then was that there must have been a common ancestor to all of these that settled here from the mainland, and then each one of these moved into these different habitats and evolved separately, but from the same common ancestor. So there was a single ancestor that ended up being the basically the donor for all of these other species, which eventually evolved from that ancestor. All right, so that was their conclusion. All right, and then they kind of worked their way back from that in terms of how this worked. So this process of speciation, now we have all of these different species. So how does this actually work, right? What happens when you take and you put these different species of finches, for example, on these different islands? What's going on to allow them to become new species? Well, before we get to that, we should probably talk about what a species is in the first place. So the classic definition of a species is something called the biological species concept, where we have species that are populations of individuals that can all breed with each other in the wild and have fertile offspring, right? So they need to be able to breed with each other. They need to be able to do that in the wild. Just in the zoo is not good enough. And they need to have fertile offspring. So you can have certain fairly similar organisms actually hybridize. They can mate with each other. For example, a zebra and a donkey can make a zonkey, right? But in the wild, their native ranges do not overlap. And so we don't get a lot of zonkies in the wild. Also, they're not fertile, right? So these zonkies can't have their own offspring as well, right? So that's the biological species concept. So the idea of okay, that we would consider then, because it doesn't fit all these criteria, that zebras and donkeys are indeed different species, right? Now the problem is this only works for sexual reproduction. Majority of organisms on the planet are not sexually reproducing. And so instead, we need to figure out some other way of dealing with that. And that's fairly arbitrary. For bacteria, for example, scientists have kind of chosen a 2.5 to 3% difference in the DNA of particular genes or genome, right? So they're looking at this saying, if it's about 2.5 to 3% difference, then it's probably a different species, right? Seems kind of arbitrary, but you just kind of have to pick a spot and keep with it. This is a bit more elegant, but there's also issues with this as well. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter how we define it. You can just let the people who taxonomists actually tell you how to do it. How do we get here to different species? Well, this is kind of the overall way that speciation works. That's what we call this process, speciation. So we have some population of an ancestral species here, all right? Something happens and we get a block in reproductive, or sort of basically in DNA, from going from population 1 to population 2 and vice versa, right? Some sort of reproductive isolation. They can't get together anymore, whatever the reason might be, right? Sometimes it's a mountain range, sometimes it's a river, sometimes they just don't mate at the same time, right? Or maybe females are only attracted to females in population 2 are only attracted to the males in that population. However it works, there is some kind of block here. Well, once this population and this one are distinct, or are no longer exchanging genetic material, well, any changes that happen here and any changes that happen here are pretty much going to stay here. And so over time, they will evolve. These populations will evolve and become more and more different, right? until we eventually get species that can no longer exchange genetic material and have fertile offspring, right? So, or just are different enough that we say that they are different species. So this is essentially the way it works. You split, and then what happens over here, the random set of mutations and the environment that's over here is going to be different than over here. Even if the environment is exactly the same, the randomness here is different from the randomness here. That's going to eventually change it enough that we get two different species, right? And this happens over many generations, and that's the ultimate result. Now, reproductive isolation can happen in many different ways. It just needs to be something that keeps genetic material from flowing between two different populations. One of the ways that the thing that probably most comes to mind would be what we call allopatric speciation, or allopatric barriers. These are situations where allopatric basically means living in different places. So the two populations are separated by a physical barrier, like a mountain range or an isthmus, for example. Could be a river or a canyon. In this case, we have two different species of fish, porkfish and the Panamanic porkfish. About 3.5 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama arose from the ocean. The Panamanic porkfish, right, the ancestral population probably was all throughout the Caribbean here and on both sides of this. Well, once this arose, due to tectonic activity, it separated the population that was here from the population that was here. They no longer exchange genetic material, and over that time they have evolved separately into different colors and are no longer the same species, right? So that would be allopatric speciation. We also can have sympatric speciation, which basically means living together. So these are populations that are not physically separated, but there needs to be some other kind of isolation. A classic example of this is the hawthorn fly. This is a tiny little fly. It lays its eggs naturally on hawthorn berries. The eggs then feed on the berries. They become larvae, and then eventually pupae, so the pupas. When they emerge as adults, the first thing they do is mate with the other flies that are also emerging. And then they go off and live their lives and then come back and lay their eggs on the hawthorns again, right? Well, when apples were introduced to North America from Central Asia, there were some flies, some hawthorn flies, preferred to lay on the new apples that were around. Well, because they lay on the apples, and the first thing that their offspring do when they hatch is to mate with other ones that are on the apples, we end up getting a situation where these ones mate together, and they never cross, right? So we have a situation where they're all living in the same area. There's nothing physically separating them, but because of how they lay their eggs, we've essentially made two separate populations and two separate species. All right. Now, there's a couple different ways that populations can change once you isolate them. Selective pressure can be directional, stabilizing, or disruptive. So directional selection is a situation where we're taking one trait and we are pushing it all in one direction. So imagine we have something like speed in cheetahs. So we have a mean speed that the cheetahs go, and then we have some that are slower and some that are faster, right? Well, over time they've gotten faster, and so the mean has increased. Well, the slowest cheetahs from a long time ago are now almost as fast as the fastest cheetahs from that time, right? And the whole population has increased. So we've taken this whole thing and shifted it this generation. That's called directional selection. We're going in one direction. So in this case, it was speed in cheetahs. You can think about the neck of a giraffe getting longer as being directional. You did a gizmo with different colored beetles, right? That color change could be also directional. We also have something called stabilizing selection. In this case, we don't actually change the mean. but we change the distribution. So in stabilizing selection, the outliers, or so the most different from the mean, have are lower fitness than the mean does. So the mean organism has the highest fitness. And what that does is it decreases the variability in the population. A good example of this is egg size or clutch size in birds. So let's imagine we have a bird that has a mean clutch size of about 4 eggs. Well, if a bird or nesting pair has, let's say, 8 eggs, like way out here, well, they're probably not going to be able to get enough resources to feed all 8 offspring. And so what happens then is that, well, they may lose most of their offspring because of that, right? So that's not a particularly fit trait then. If you lay only 1 egg or 2 eggs, well, then you've got these other, you're actually not doing as many as you could, and birds that lay 4 are going to have more offspring, and so they're going to be more fit as well. So we have a situation where too many eggs, too few eggs are both less fit than right on the mean. All right, so that's a stabilizing selection sort of situation. And then we have disruptive selection, where again the mean doesn't really change, but the population, we end up with the extremes for the traits being the best or the most fit, and the mean being the least fit. A situation like this, say, imagine we have our giraffe again, and we have some giraffes with long necks and some giraffes with short necks. The long neck giraffes do really good at getting leaves from up high, with shorter necked ones are better at eating grass on the ground. The medium ones don't do well with getting grass on the ground or with going up high, and so they end up having lower fitness than the other two, right? So this is kind of the start of pushing these two into almost 2 separate populations. All right, so that's directional, stabilizing, and disruptive. And then lastly, we have our rates of evolution. So once you get separation, you can go at different rates, right? The speed of evolution. We've mostly talked about what we call gradualism, which right here, gradualism is we get some sort of change, some sort of isolation, and gradually over time, this one changes to here and this one changes to here, right? So that's our gradualism situation. There's another model, though, that looks at this and says, well, what if we had these butterfly here go for a long time without a lot of change, right? Kind of a stasis, an equilibrium. And then something happens, say right here, and causes rapid evolution to another species, which then goes and continues on without a lot of change, right? And then this one goes on, and then boom, we get another rapid evolution. So this is called punctuated equilibrium. The idea being that we have long periods of not a lot of change interspersed with rapid evolution into new species. Both theories have evidence for them, and actually, most scientists nowadays don't really choose between one or the other. Instead, there's an acknowledgement that the speed of evolution, the rate of evolution changes, right? Depending on how much the environment's changing. So if, let's say, you get like a meteorite hitting and causing a major environmental disaster, right? Well, you might have a lot more selective pressure and more rapid change during that time. But it doesn't mean that during these times of relative calm and stability that this is not changing, right? So we probably have some mix here of gradualism and punctuated equilibrium happening all the time. So it makes more sense to think of this in terms of rates of evolution instead. All right, and that's it for this set of slides.